Hey guys, today I'm going to show you how to install Havoc Offroad's 5-inch lift kit on this 2017 Toyota Tundra 4-wheel drive. Now before you get started, you need to know that there is going to be some cutting and welding on this application, so make sure you read through the instructions and that you're comfortable with it. Our truck also has a 2-piece drive shaft, which means we had to also purchase the carrier drop bracket kit, which is sold separately. Let's go ahead and get started. Alright guys, so we're underneath the vehicle, we got our wheels and tires off, and the first thing we need to do is remove this skid plate. And we're going to start by removing these three 10mm bolts right here. And you're also going to have 5 13mm bolts that are kind of set inside the skid plate. You can't really see them unless you look underneath, but our first one is right here. And then there's going to be one right here. And then your final one's going to be right in the middle on the back. Alright, the next thing that we're going to do is loosen our jam nut. And we're going to use a 30mm on the jam nut and then a 27 on the tie rod. Once that's broke loose, you can just thread that down a little bit, and then we're actually going to remove the cotter pin and the castle nut and the tie rod altogether. Now we'll use a 24mm socket to loosen our castle nut. And we're not going to take that off completely, we're actually going to thread that on a couple more threads so that we can strike the knuckle and actually release this tie rod. Alright, when you're doing this, you want to use a sledge or a hammer, and you want to make sure that you're only hitting the knuckle. You don't want to hit the tie rod and damage that in any way. So once that loosens up, you can just take it off completely. Next thing that we're going to do is remove the sway bar end link from the lower control arm. That's going to be a 19mm. And you're going to want to do that from both sides, and then we're going to remove the sway bar altogether. So now before you take off your sway bar, you're going to want to mark the orientation of it so that when you go to put it back in, it goes back in the same way. So we're on the passenger side, so I'm going to write a P, and then I'm going to put an arrow just so that we know that this was facing towards the front of the vehicle. Now we can go ahead and remove the sway bar. There's going to be 2 17mm bolts on your passenger side and 2 on your driver's side. Alright, so the next thing that we're going to do is remove our brake line and our ABS line from the knuckle and from the frame. So this bolt is going to be a 12mm. We're also going to remove this bracket that's connecting to our ABS line. And to get to that bolt, we're actually going to have to pop this retaining clip out. And that'll allow us to get our 12mm in there. And then remove that line. And we'll also use a 12mm to remove the brake line from the frame. So now we have a bracket at the top of the upper control arm, and that's holding in our ABS line. We're actually going to remove this line from the bracket and then remove the bracket from the truck. Now you can do this a couple different ways. You can use a pair of channel locks, or you can use a screwdriver, but you just want to bend that bracket open so that you can get the ABS line out, and then you can remove the bracket. And we're going to use a 10mm to remove that bracket. Now we're going to remove the ABS line, and that's going to be a 5mm Allen head. I'm just going to set that to the side. So now we're going to remove our brake caliper, and that's going to be two 19mm bolts. When you take this off, you're going to want to hang it up out of the way. Make sure that all your brake lines have some slack in them. You don't want this thing resting on a brake line and having that snap. Now that the caliper's off, we can just pull the rotor off and set that aside. So next we're going to remove the dust cap, and to do that you're going to get a small chisel or a flathead screwdriver. We're going to stick it in the crease between the hub and the shield, and we're going to use a hammer and just kind of lightly tap to try to create some separation in there. And then once we get enough separation, it should just fall off. You want to make sure to be careful. You don't want to mar up this surface or anything like that, because we are going to want to put these back on. So once you get some separation, you can get the screwdriver in there and then pry on it just a little bit, and it should just come off. So now we can remove the cotter pin that's holding on our axle nut. So next I'm going to remove the axle nut with a 39mm 12-point socket. So now we're going to use an air hammer to break the axle loose from the hub. So now that the axle shaft is broke loose from the hub, we can use a 17mm and loosen the 4 bolts that are holding the hub to the knuckle. Now we're going to remove the castle nut that's holding the knuckle to the upper control arm. And to do that, you're going to push in this cotter pin, and with a screwdriver, you're going to get in there and pry it up, and then you should be able to pull it out. And then we can use a 19mm to loosen the nut. And as you can see, the knuckle's not coming with it, so we actually need to use a sledge and hit this a little bit so that it can break this loose. And again, just make sure you're only hitting the knuckle. And now you can use a pry bar to pull down the upper control arm, and you can get that nut off. And then just hold it down while you get the pry bar out. So now we're going to remove the 2 bolts at the bottom of the knuckle, and then remove the knuckle completely. Alright, so now we're going to loosen our lower control arm bolts. We're just going to loosen them for right now. And that's going to use 24mm. And now these bolts are cammed so that you can only loosen them on the front side. If you look on the other side, you can see that it's captured and you can't rotate this side. So now we're going to remove the strut from the lower control arm. We're going to have a 22mm wrench on the head of the bolt and a 22mm socket on the nut. Now we can remove the control arm completely from the vehicle. Then repeat all of those steps on the other side. So our next step is going to be to remove our differential actuator connector, and that's right here. you should just be able to push in the clips and then pull it free. So you can't really see it on the camera, but you have a breather tube, and then on top you're actually going to have a vacuum tube, and you're just going to remove those right now. Next, we're going to disconnect the drive shaft from the differential, and that's going to be 4 14mm nuts. Alright, so now we're ready to actually remove the differential from the vehicle. So you want to make sure that you have it supported at this point with a hydraulic jack, and we're going to go ahead and start removing the bolts that are holding it in place. The first 2 bolts that we're going to remove are on the driver's side towards the rear of the differential. There's going to be one right here, and there's going to be one that's inset into the rear crossmember. And those are all 19mm bolts. And our last 2 bolts are going to be towards the front of the differential, and they're going to be attached to the front crossmember right here and back here. Also 19mm bolts. Alright, so at this point you're probably going to want to get a couple guys to steady the differential as you're lowering it down. Just make sure you're going nice and slow, and just be careful. Okay, so as we were lowering down the differential, we noticed that our differential bracket in the rear was actually getting in the way a little bit. So we have another 19mm bolt. I'm going to remove that and then remove this bracket. Okay, so the next thing that we have to do is actually cut our rear crossmember out of the vehicle. Now to do that, we're going to make a mark at 3 13/16 of an inch on the driver's side pocket in the front, and it's going to roughly line up with the bottom of the pocket. Go ahead and make that mark a couple times, and then just continue that line all the way to the top. Now this is the back side of the driver's side pocket, and we're going to mark it at about 3 3/8 of an inch from the edge of the pocket. And again, it's going to roughly line up with the very bottom line of the pocket. And again, we're going to get our straight edge. We're going to do our best to continue that line all the way up the frame. And then we're going to connect it at the top. So now we're at the rear crossmember on the passenger side, and we're going to measure from the bottom of the pocket and out across the crossmember to 3 inches. We're going to make a couple marks there. It should be right beside this small circular hole. And then we're going to continue this line all the way down the bottom and up the sides. All right, now we're on the passenger side, and we're going to make this cut. All right, so now that we got our rear crossmember cut out, Your kit's going to come with a plate that needs to be welded here and a plate that needs to be welded here. What you're going to want to do is make sure you grind all this stuff down, make sure it's nice and clean before you start welding it. And then after it gets welded, you're going to wait for it to cool, and then you're going to want to paint all the raw surfaces. All right, now your bigger plate is going to go on your driver's side, and you can see it kind of contours to the shape that you cut out. So on your passenger side, you're going to have the smaller plate, and again, it's going to conform kind of to the frame that you cut out, and just make sure you weld that in place. All right, now that we have our plates welded into place and it's cooled down, we can go ahead and spray paint it. Then we'll go ahead and paint our passenger side as well. Remember, you want to paint any exposed metal so that way we can keep it from rusting. All right, we got our front cross member here on the table. Now before we can install that, we need to install our crush sleeves. And there's going to be 2 holes in the top of the cross member, so we're just going to drop those in there. So now we're ready to install our front cross member, and you want to make sure that the bend in the cross member is facing towards the front of the vehicle, and it's just going to fit right in to our lower control arm holes. All right, so as you put that up there, it might be a little tight. You might have to get a mallet and kind of force it up a little bit. So when you get your front cross member in, you want to make sure you run your bolt from front to rear with a large flat washer. All right, and on the back, you're going to get another flat washer and a locking nut. Now you want to make sure when you're putting these washers on that you have them captured in the frame. We're going to replace our factory vacuum line and breather hose. So we need to remove these from the hard line. And then it just pops off, and the smaller one should just pull off as well. Your kit's going to come with 2 new hoses to accommodate the drop in the differential. The smaller hose is going to go on your hard line, and you should just be able to push that on like that. The larger one is going to go up here, and that should just push on as well. And we're also got a hose clamp that's going to go on there. All right, so again, we got a couple guys here to help us steady the diff as we raised it back into the truck. And we're going to try to mount our front 2 brackets to the new cross member. So now we're at the front of the front cross member, and as you can see, our factory bracket is lining up with our new front cross member, and your kit's going to provide you with a bolt and a washer, but you're also going to want to use your large factory washer. You're going to go up through the bracket, through the hole, through the crushed sleeve, and then at the top you're going to get another washer and a nut. And we're just going to leave these loose for right now. And you're going to do that on both front mounting locations. Okay, here's our two hoses that we put on earlier, and we're going to attach them to the hard lines. Should just push on pretty easily. Same for the larger one. Okay, so now we have our rear differential mounting bracket, and it's got two ribs on this side here that you can see, and these have to be ground down about 1/4 of an inch to provide for clearance for the new differential mount. Now we're going to loosely install our rear differential mounting bracket into the same location that it came out of with the original bolt. And you want to make sure that you install this in the same orientation that it came out, with the captured stud by your flange. And we're just going to loosely install this for right now. So now we can install our rear cross member. Now you're going to want to make sure that the stud for our rear bracket lines up with this hole in the top of our cross member. Alright, so when you get your rear cross member in, you're going to use a provided bolt and flat washer. Again, same with the front. You want to make sure that that flat washer is captured. And then you're going to get another one on the back with a nut, and make sure that you're running that bolt from the rear to the front of the vehicle. And then do that on the other side as well. Now we can put our factory nut back on the stud. Alright, now on the other side of our rear differential bracket, you are going to have another hole that should line up with your rear cross member. And we're going to use a provided bolt and washer, go through the cross member, through the bracket, with another washer and nut on top. And we'll leave that loose for right now. Alright, so now we have our differential pushed as rearward as possible, and we're going to tighten down our front mounting bolts to 90 foot-pounds. Next, I'm going to reconnect my differential actuator. You just want to push that in until you hear it click into place. Now we're going to reinstall our drive shaft with our factory washers and nuts. And we're going to tighten them down to 50 foot-pounds. Now we can install our lower control arms into our new front and rear cross members. You're going to install your lower control arms with your factory bolts, and you want to make sure that your cams are locked into the grooves. I'm going to leave those loose for right now. Go ahead and repeat that on the other side. Okay, so now we're going to tighten down our 3 mounting locations for our rear differential bracket. The one that's, the 2 that are through the cross member, and then the one that goes directly into the differential. We're going to tighten those down to 90 foot-pounds. So that one's a 19 millimeter, and the one that's inside the cross member is a 19 millimeter as well. All right, and on our bolt that is provided in the kit, you're going to use a 13/16 on the head and a 7/8 on the nut to tighten that down to 90 foot-pounds. Now we're going to use a 34 millimeter to tighten down our 2 front cross member top bolts. So the next thing that we're going to do is weld some steering stop tabs onto our lower control arms. And now they're going to weld onto the front part of the lower control arm, the part furthest towards the front of the vehicle. And you'll see that it kind of contours exactly to that spot, so we just need to weld that up, clean it up, and paint it. Okay, now we're on the passenger side of the vehicle, and the next thing that we're going to do is remove the rear bump stop. You're going to have to take a large crescent wrench, or we got a pipe wrench here, just like that. It's threaded in there, so as soon as you break it loose, it should twist off pretty easily. Okay, so now we have our bump stop extension, and it's passenger and driver side specific. So to locate your, we're on the passenger side, so the passenger one is going to fit over your top crossmember bolt, and then it's going to fit right up to where the original bump stop was taken out, with the hole facing towards your differential. Your kit's going to come with another large washer that's going to go over our crossmember bolt, and then we're going to thread the nut back on. And your kit is also going to come with a smaller bolt and washer that's going to thread back into the factory bump stop location. And our new bump stop is going to go right through the bottom hole with a flange nut on top. And you want to tighten that bump stop just until it starts to feel tight. And you don't want to go too much, because then it'll start to deform the stop itself. So I'm going to use a 17 millimeter to tighten down the bolt that went to our factory hole. We're going to tighten that down to 20 foot-pounds. Now we're going to tighten down our top rear crossmember bolt to 140 foot-pounds. And then go ahead and repeat that on the other side. Next, we're going to install our strut extensions. Now your kit's going to come with 2, one for the driver and passenger side. They're both exactly the same, so you just need to grab one. And what we're going to do is we're going to line it up with the skinny portion of the factory strut. And sometimes they'll go right over, but if they don't, like this one, you might have to just take a mallet and just smack it on, and then it's going to line up. You have a large hole here that's going to line up with your original factory strut hole, and then you have two more holes up here, and that's just going to tighten down to the strut. Okay, your kit's going to come with a large bolt and washer that's going to go through that bottom hole. And you're going to have a washer and a nut that goes on the back of that. Now on the two smaller holes, we're going to put a provided bolt and washer, and then on the inside another washer, and then you have a crush sleeve that's also going to go in there. And then after the crush sleeve, there's going to be another washer, and then through the other side of the bracket, and then on the back is going to be another washer and a nut. We're going to do that on both of those holes. Now we can use a 24mm socket and wrench to tighten down our larger bolt to 125 foot-pounds. And we're going to tighten our two smaller bolts to 25 foot-pounds. Okay, so now we're going to attach our new strut extension to our lower control arm. You can just swing the lower control arm up and push the extension in, and then we're going to use our factory bolt, go down a little bit, to go back through the control arm and through the strut. Might be a little tight, you might have to get a mallet. And you can put your factory nut on the end. So now we have our old knuckle on the table, and we need to remove our hub seal so that we can install it on our new knuckle. So I'm going to go ahead and flip this over. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a piece of wood, and you're going to lightly just tap that seal out. You don't want to be too rough on it. You don't want to damage it at all, because if you damage it, you're going to have to go get a new one. But it should come out fairly easily. Now we have our new knuckle on the table, and as you can see, there's this recessed portion here, and that's where your hub seal is going to go. So you're going to set that right in. You should be able to push it in a little bit, kind of start the seating, and then you're going to take that same piece of wood, and we're going to kind of just place it across the hub seal, and we're going to tap it into place. Now you want to make sure that your hub seal is fully seated when you do this. Alright, so that looks good. When you look on the inside, you shouldn't be able to see any kind of gap or anything, and that's how you'll know when it's fully seated. Now we're going to install our new knuckle with our factory bolts. Go ahead and put it up there. Okay. Just hold it right there. We're going to use some red Loctite that was provided in the kit with our bolts. So see that right there, and try to line that up. There you go. Once we get these bolts started, we're going to go ahead and tighten those down to 175 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to attach our upper control arm to our knuckle. And you're going to have to pry down with a pry bar or some kind of tool, and pry down on that upper control arm to get the ball joint seated inside the knuckle. Go ahead, keep going, keep going, keep going. And once you do that, you can start your castle nut. And And then that should hold everything. And then we're going to tighten down our castle nut to 80 foot-pounds and reinstall our factory cotter pin. We can use a 19mm to tighten down our castle nut. Now you want to remember, when you're lining up your cotter pin, you never want to loosen the castle nut to make it line. You always want to tighten it just a little bit more. Once you get your castle nut torqued down, you can reinstall your cotter pin. So now we can install our dust shield and our hub assembly. When you're aligning your hub, you want to make sure that your splines are matching up. In your CV shaft, there you go, like that. And then before you put your 4 bolts in, you want to apply some red Loctite to those bolts. You want to apply the Loctite to all 4 bolts. All right, so once you got your Loctite on, it's going to be a tight fit, but you should be able to push your hub assembly in enough to start threading some bolts in. And then once we get some started, we can start tightening it down, and it'll pull the hub assembly into the knuckle, and it'll pull the CV axle shaft in from the other direction as well, and tighten everything together. Okay, so now we can use a 17mm to tighten down our 4 hub assembly bolts. You want to make sure that you're tightening them down a little bit at a time and equally on all 4, because you don't want to pull in one side too much than another side, and it might throw things off balance. So just get a couple turns on one, go to the next one, get a few turns, go to the next one, and then just keep doing that until everything's nice and tight. And then from there we can torque these bolts to spec. All right, now that we have everything tightened up, we're going to go ahead and torque these down to 73 foot-pounds. Now we can put our axle nut back on. And we're going to tighten this down to 250 foot-pounds with our 39mm axle socket. Next, we're going to put our nut cap back on, and the kit is going to come with a new cotter pin for us to use. You can put that in as well. Next, we can reinstall our dust cap. You can just push it on to kind of start it, and then just give it a few taps with a mallet and just make sure it's flush all the way around. So now we can set the rotor in place, and we're going to use some lug nuts to hold the rotor in place while we put the brake caliper on. Okay, and now we can put our caliper in place. We're going to reuse our factory bolts. All right, to get the caliper over here, you're going to have to bend your brake hard lines a little bit. So just be careful with that you don't kink them at all, and just bend them slowly. So when you get both bolts in, we're going to go ahead and tighten them down to 73 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to attach our factory brake line bracket to the new knuckle using the original hardware. And again, you're probably going to have to bend your hard line a little bit to get this bracket in place, so just be careful with that. I'm going to go ahead and tighten that down with a 12mm. So the next thing we're going to do is attach our ABS line, but our bracket that's going to attach to the back of the knuckle needs to move down some. So we're actually going to remove this bracket from the ABS line. And you can do that with a screwdriver. You can just stick that in the clip and kind of twist it, and you should be able to twist it up and then pull it out just like that. And we're going to do the same thing on this one. Go. Now before we reattach that bracket, we're going to plug in our ABS line and tighten that down so that we know exactly where that bracket needs to go. Now we're going to reattach our ABS bracket with the factory bolt. That's also going to be a 12 millimeter. So now we can reattach our wire clips and put our ABS line back through there. And then you can put the ABS line in the second clip as well and lock it down. Next, we're going to attach a brake line relocation bracket to the frame. This is going to be, we're on the passenger side, this is right to the left of the strut. And we're going to use a factory bolt to go from the bracket to the frame, and then your kit is going to come with a washer, lock washer, and a nut to go with the stud that's going to go to our factory brake line bracket, just like that. Alright, so before we tighten this down, we're going to make sure everything fits right, and we're going to attach our factory brake line bracket to the stud with our washer, lock washer, and nut, and then we'll go back and tighten both of these down. So with all your brake line brackets and ABS lines all tied up, right now you're going to want to swing your whole knuckle assembly from side to side, lock to lock, and you're looking for any kind of tightness in the lines or anything that could pinch. If you see something like that, you might have to readjust some of your lines, but if you're good, we can go ahead and move to the next step. Alright, so now we're going to install our sway bar drop brackets. Your kit's going to come with 2 of them, and they're going to be exactly the same. You just want to make sure that the opening is facing towards the inside of the vehicle, and we're going to put those back into the frame rail with our factory bolts. So now we can use a 17 millimeter to tighten these bolts to 40 foot-pounds. Alright, now we're going to attach our sway bar to our sway bar drop brackets. Your kit's going to come with 4 new bolts and 8 washers, 1 on each side of the bracket, as well as 4 nuts. So now before we tighten down the bolts from the sway bar to the drop brackets, we're going to put our factory bolt back through the sway bar to the lower control arm. We're going to do that on both sides. Alright, our sway bar end links, we're going to tighten down to 90 foot-pounds. So now we can go ahead and tighten down our sway bar bolts. We're going to use a 5/8 on the head of the bolt and an 11/16 on the nut. We're going to tighten those down to 40 foot-pounds. Okay. Alright, so now we're going to remove our tie rod. We're going to hold our jam nut in place because our new tie rod that's provided in the kit, we're going to thread it on all the way up to the jam nut and then tighten the jam nut onto that. So we got our new tie rod, should thread right on. Your kit's going to come with two, they are not side specific. You're going to tighten that all the way up to your jam nut. We're going to turn it down one more time because you want to have your stud going down, and then we'll go ahead and tighten that up. So now we're going to install our new tie rod into our knuckle. I'm going to twist our castle nut off. This plastic piece you can just discard, that's just to protect the boot. Put our new castle nut back on. We'll tighten that down to 51 foot-pounds. So now we can install our new cotter pin. And now we can use a 30mm to tighten down our jam nut. Now we're set up in the rear. The first thing that we're going to do is remove the parking brake bracket on the passenger and driver side, and that's going to be a 12mm. And the next thing we're going to do is remove the 3 brake line bolts right here, here, and here. And that's also going to be a 12mm. Next, we're going to use a screwdriver to remove the ABS clip on the back of the bracket that's on top of the differential, and we're actually going to remove this clip from the ABS line altogether. On the driver's side, to the right of the leaf spring, there's going to be an ABS bracket. We're also going to remove that with a 12mm. Alright, now if you follow your ABS line up to the chassis, you're going to see a bracket. We're going to bend that bracket down so that it's almost pointed towards the axle. And that's going to give us a little bit more slack when we install the lift. So now we're ready to remove our rear shocks. You want to make sure that your axle is fully supported, whether that's one hydraulic stand in the middle. We chose to go with 2 jack stands, one on each side, so that we could have leverage on whichever side that we were working on. Now we're going to use a 17mm socket and wrench to remove the lower part of the shock. Now we can use a 17mm to remove the nut at the top of the shock. Alright, so now we're going to take the 4 nuts that are holding our U-bolts off. When you're doing this, you want to work on one side of the truck at a time. You don't want to loosen up both sides because that could make the whole axle unstable. So just work on one side at a time. We're going to use a 19mm. And now you can remove the factory U-bolts. Alright, so now that you got the U-bolts off, you're going to want to lower this side of the axle so that we can get our spacer block in there. While you're lowering this down, you want to keep an eye on all of your brake lines just to make sure that nothing is tight. So when you have your axle dropped low enough for the lift block to go in, you're going to notice that it's going to have a tapered side. The smaller side is going to go towards the front of the vehicle, and the notch at the bottom is going to go right into the notch in your frame. And there's going to be a notch in the top that'll line up with the pin in the leaf spring when you bring it back up. So you're going to want to watch that, make sure it lines up. You can kind of twist it a little bit. Then it should go in nice and smooth. Our new U-bolts are going to install the same way that the old ones did. You want to make sure as you're pushing it down that you push it behind our brake line and our ABS line. Next we can reinstall our plate. And our kit is going to come with new washers and nuts. And when we get these on, we're just going to snug them up, and then we're going to do our final tightening with the weight of the vehicle when it's back on the ground. And you're going to repeat that process on the opposite side. Alright, so we got the bottom portion of our shock. Now before we can install this on the truck, we need to install our rubber bushing, and then we have a metal sleeve that's going to go in there. So what we're going to do is we're going to use some heavy duty silicone spray. You can use grease, anything that's slippery. You might even be able to use like dish soap. But anyway, just get both sides lubricated, and then you can kind of try to start it with your hand. Most of the time that doesn't work, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a mallet, just like that, and then your metal sleeve should easily push right in. And you're going to want to do that on both shocks. Alright, now this is the top of our shock. When we're installing this on the truck, it's going to come with 2 metal sleeves and 2 rubber bushings. Now one is drilled larger than the other one. That's going to be your bottom metal sleeve and bushing, and they're going to go just like that. It's going to go up through the truck, and then you're going to put your other rubber bushing and metal sleeve, and then your nut is going to go on top of that. So we're going to install the top of our shock first, and again you're going to have the larger metal washer followed by the larger rubber bushing up through the truck, and then your other rubber bushing and metal washer, and then your nut. Alright, so before we tighten down the top of our shock, we're going to install the bottom. We're going to use our factory bolt and nut. We're going to have to push up on the shock a little bit, and then kind of work it into position. Sometimes it can be a little bit tight. And then you can put your nut on. So now we're going to tighten our lower shock mount to 65 foot-pounds. And now we can use a 19mm to tighten our upper shock mount to 20 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to install our ABS line relocation bracket. Now your kit's going to come with 2 brackets for the rear, and then we're going to use the longer one to relocate the ABS line. So we're on the driver's side in the location that's to the right of the driver's side leaf spring. We're going to put our new bracket, and we're going to tighten that to the axle with the factory nut, and it's just going to go completely vertical. I'm going to go ahead and tighten that down. Okay, so now we're going to tighten our factory bracket to our new bracket with a provided bolt and washer on the front, and a washer and nut on the back. We'll go ahead and tighten that down. All right, so next, your kit's gonna come with a retaining clip, and we're gonna put that over our ABS line. It should just push right over our little rubber insulator there, and then we can close that with a pair of channel locks. And now what that's going to allow us to do is when we get our bracket in there, it'll allow us to attach this to the bracket so that this ABS line isn't just all loose. So now we're going to get our smaller bracket bolts, and that's going to go through the retaining clip, through the bracket, with a washer and a nut on the back. Then we'll go ahead and get our top bolt in, just like that, and then we'll go ahead and tighten it all down. All right, top bolt again is going to be with a bolt and washer on the front, and a washer and a nut on the back. All right, now that we got both bolts in, we can go ahead and tighten them all down. Now on our other two brake line bracket locations, we're going to flip our factory bracket all the way around and then reinstall it with our factory bolt. And then we'll go ahead and tighten those down. Now our e-brake brackets are not going to be reused, so you can just bend those open and just remove them from the vehicle. Okay, so we're right about in the middle of the vehicle, and as you can see, we have a two-piece drive shaft on our truck, so we need to have a carrier bearing drop kit installed. So the first thing that we're going to do that is remove these two 14mm bolts. Okay, your kit's going to come with two spacers and two long bolts and washers. So your spacer is going to go on top, and then our bolt is going to go through that with the washer on it, and we're going to put some Loctite on both of these bolts, some red Loctite. And then we're just going to thread those bolts back into the factory hole. We're going to tighten those down to 30 foot-pounds. Alright, so now we got the truck back on the ground, we got our new wheels and tires on, and now we can torque down our U-bolts to 120 foot-pounds. And now we can tighten our lower strut mounting bolts to 140 foot-pounds. Now we can tighten down our two lower control arm cam bolts to 200 foot-pounds on both sides. Alright guys, we just got the truck back from the alignment shop. Now remember, after about 500 miles, you're going to want to go back underneath and make sure all your bolts are still torqued to spec. But that completes the installation. If you have any questions, give us a call or visit us online. Thanks.